First of all, one of the things that I wanted to say is I think it's important to understand what's happened in the last 3 weeks, not in terms, unfortunately, of the way the press has hopefully put it as a revolution driven by social networking tools. I think what we've seen here is effectively a preemptive military coup. What I mean by that is, if you've been, for at least the last 5 years, the key issue in Egypt, this was even when the Bush administration was putting pressure on Mubarak to open up and liberalize, and during the last presidential elections, during Egypt's last presidential elections, the key issue has been one of succession. That is, who is going to replace Hosni Mubarak. The two key rivals, or the two key candidates, were always Hosni Mubarak's son Gamal and Omar Suleiman, who was the chief of intelligence and who, of course, was named 2 weeks ago officially to be Mubarak's vice president. And now it seems that Omar Suleiman is once again out of the picture. We'll see what happens to Suleiman, but right now the government, the regime is in the hands of the Supreme Council of the Military. And Field Marshal Tantawi appears to have effective control of the country. At any rate, this was the competition between Gamal Mubarak and Omar Suleiman. I don't know if there was really competition between the two of them, but what Hosni Mubarak needed to do was he needed to campaign with the military and security elites on behalf of his son Gamal. One of the things that we don't know for sure, but one of the things that we hear rumored, or that we heard rumored quite often, was that in fact Hosni Mubarak did not want his son Gamal to succeed him as much as the First Lady, Hosni Mubarak's wife, Suzanne Mubarak wanted Gamal to succeed her husband. So apparently this was something that the mother wanted more than the father. The problem that the military had with Gamal was, well, first of all, that Gamal was not a part of the military establishment. He'd never served in uniform. He certainly wasn't a war hero. He'd never served in war as his father had. And it's important to keep in mind what we're looking at here is a free officers regime. It's a military regime, okay? It's been the same regime since the 1952 coup that deposed King Farouk and which Nasser was at the head of. After that, there was Anwar Sadat, who was also a free officer, and Sadat picked as his vice president Hosni Mubarak, who had been the head of the Air Force, and who again was a hero of the 73, was a war hero. So the problem was when Mubarak started to see the government of Egypt not as a free officers regime, not as a military regime, but as a family dynasty, the Mubarak dynasty. And this was the idea about having Gamal replace him. As you'll recall, the free officers revolution of 1952, it overthrew the dynasty started by Muhammad Ali upon Napoleon's departure from Egypt. He was the man who inherited modern Egypt, and it was the Alid dynasty that ruled Egypt up until 1952. Anyway, the military regime was against Gamal succeeding Hosni Mubarak. What we've seen on the street the last 3 weeks was the military took advantage of what was happening on the street, and it let the popular will usher out Gamal Mubarak, which is something that they'd wanted all along. They saw what was happening on the street, and they took advantage of this. To step back for a second to Tunisia, this is basically what we saw in Tunisia as well. Again, this was not a popular Twitter-driven revolution, as much as many people would like to believe this. What happened was, in Tunisia, the Ben Ali regime was marked by corruption, especially Ben Ali's wife. The wife's family, rather. The family was rotten to the core, and they had their hands in everything. Now, of course, the Tunisian military was not as wealthy as the Egyptian military, among other things. It doesn't get $1.3 billion a year in military aid from the United States. However, the retirement benefits essentially amounted to Tunisian senior officers having some sort of retirement nest egg that would either come through contracting or some sorts of forms of investment in Tunisia. But it was the fact that Ibn Ali's wife's family had a hand in everything and basically bled these retirement plans dry. So when people went to the streets of Tunisian cities, the military said to Ibn Ali, the head of the military, Rashid Ahmad, we're not going anywhere. It's you who are leaving. So that's what happened. Again, this was a military coup. The military said, this is the head of this military regime, which is what Tunisia effectively was no longer representing the interest of the military, and the military displaced him. This is what happened in Egypt. Again, it's important to remember Hosni Mubarak was the man in suit and tie at the head of a military regime. He was the public face of a military regime. Once Hosni Mubarak started to confuse the fact and imagine that he was the beginning of a family dynasty, that's when he got in trouble with the military. The military used what happened on the street to get rid of Gamal Mubarak. I believe, this is something we don't know for sure yet though, I believe that both many of the people who had been out in the streets and the military as well were content to let Hosni Mubarak actually stay in power until after the September elections as he planned. But it was both foreign pressure, including especially from Washington, but more especially it was the people on the streets. So I'm not discounting by any means the popular unrest. It's a key factor. Again, I don't look at it as a popular revolution, but the popular unrest, the popular uprising was a key factor. When these people did not leave the streets, when they did not leave Tahrir Square, the military needed a way to get those people off the street. This has been a key factor from the beginning. This unrest destabilizes the country. It gets military and security people very nervous. So they wanted to get those people off the street. At a certain point, they found out the only way they were going to be able to get those people off the street was by having Hosni Mubarak leave office, which is where we are today. Now, there are a number of different problems. I mean, again, most of you, I'm sure, have been following the press reports, and really one of the things that's truly astonished me is the notion that no one seems to get the fact that what we've watched here is a military coup. Again, quite specifically, it's the Supreme Military Council that's in charge of the country. Now, the dangers here are that the military may come to enjoy being ruling directly, not through intermediaries, the way it had with Mubarak. So this is one concern, and so there are people in the administration, and there are people throughout the Washington policy establishment who are anxious to have the military move on to these promised rounds of elections, both presidential elections, elections to put in place a new parliament, and also to ratify a new constitution. However, it's unclear how quickly this is going to move. We're talking about 6 months, but we're talking about three different issues that have to be taken care of in elections here. Again, the presidency, a new parliament, because parliament has been disbanded, and ratifying a new constitution. So it's hard to believe that this is all going to be done in 6 months. And of course, the military, the Supreme Council for the Military, has warned that maybe it's not going to happen in 6 months. Maybe it will happen when we're ready. So this is a concern. The other concern is that if you look at popular unrest over the last, or if you look at actual problems in the regime, the engine of regime unrest is always junior officers in the military. I mean, Nasser's free officers who deposed the king in 1952, these were younger officers. They were not senior officers. The military cadre that killed Anwar Sadat, this was a group also. This was a military operation composed, it's important we attribute this to Islamist factions, and of course it was Islamic Jihad as well as Gama Islamiyya. But the other thing to remember is these were military officers. Sadat's actual assassin, Khalid Islambuli, was, I believe, a lieutenant in the Egyptian army. So this is where we really need to be paying attention, looking at the junior officers, and if they're going to make a run at some of their superior officers. So the longer the military actually holds on to power like this, the more and more dangerous it is that this is what's going to happen. The junior officers will make a run at what's going on. Now, So in some ways, we'd like to move to elections as quickly as possible. The problem in this situation is, moving toward elections, we don't see anyone. It's very difficult to know. I mean, we can imagine some of the candidates who might be running for president, including, say, Mohamed al-Baradei, Amr Moussa. There are people who are from the old regime. Amr Moussa is from the old regime. And there are military people from the old regime, like the current Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq, who might run. There are a number of other people as well who might make a run. The problem is that for the United States, if we're looking at the people that we would be most interested in, if we want to see a military regime transition into a more reform itself into a more liberal government responsive to the needs of its people, it's very difficult to tell right now who is in place to do that. So this is one of the problems with moving too quickly. So if either you move too slowly or you move too quickly, there are problems. I want to say that right now, I don't see that the Muslim Brotherhood is an enormous concern. I think that certainly the Brotherhood will become a concern. I think the main issue right now is the military and junior members of the military who may or may not be, aligned with various Islamist factions. I think that the Brotherhood is going to be a problem over the long term. I don't believe it when people talk about the moderate nature of the Brotherhood. I think this is a misreading of what the Brotherhood wants and what the Brotherhood thinks. And again, if you look at some of the things that the President has said and others have said, that there are other people in the government as well, more moderate factions, and it's very unlikely that the Muslim Brotherhood would win in large rounds of elections because people want moderate, secular representatives in their government. Well, look, unfortunately, we just don't know this. When people say that the Egyptians have seen the problems with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they want nothing like the IRI in Egypt. Well, I mean, the Palestinians saw the same thing, but nonetheless, the Palestinians elected Hamas in that round of elections. More significantly, from my perspective, is if you look at Lebanon, now the last people who would ever you would suspect who would ever want to be aligned with the Islamic Republic, of course, this would be after the Jews of Israel. The last people who would ever want to be aligned with the Islamic Republic of Iran is Lebanon's Christian community. Nonetheless, 30% of Lebanon's Christian community are aligned with the Iranians through their leader, General Michel Aoun, who has an alliance with Hezbollah. So the notion that 30% of Lebanon's Christians are tied to an Islamist regime is frightening. And what that says is there are all sorts of ways the Muslim Brotherhood can get power. And it doesn't necessarily get power because of the fact that people want an Islamist regime. There are people who do want an Islamist regime, but even people who don't, there are various ways that Islamist parties, Islamist actors can get power. And Lebanon is a good example of this, and so are the Palestinian territories. Again, as I said, though, not to belabor this too much, I think there are many more important and many more pressing issues right now than the Muslim Brotherhood. But again, I just to finish up on the Brotherhood, I do want to say the Brotherhood will be a factor. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually it will definitely be a factor. I look at the Muslim Brotherhood not just as an organization that began in 1928, but I look at it as the flower in political modernity, meaning it's inseparable from political modernity in Egypt. I tie this back to Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt, out of which came the Salafist movement, where Egyptian intellectuals and activists, political activists, ideologues looked at the invasion and they said, look, if the Ummah is supposed to be, in the words of the Prophet of Islam, the best of all nations, how did Napoleon and his infidel troops overrun us so easily? Their answer was that the answer of various Muslim activists like Jamal ad-Din Afghani, who was living in Cairo at the time, and his his chief disciple and collaborator, Muhammad Abduh, their answer was that the Ummah had become weak because of Islam, or they were no longer practicing a vibrant and vital Islam. The problem was the way that Muslims actually worshipped. The faith had become weakened. It had become fatalist and superstitious because of a whole bunch of non-Islamic practices. Some associated with Sufism, some associated with Christianity and other practices, some of them just associated with folkloric practices that have more to do with native traditions in the Egyptian countryside than Islam. But their answer was to return Islam to the real faith as practiced by Muhammad the Prophet, his companions, and his earliest successors, all of them combined, known as the Salaf, meaning the righteous forebears, the Salaf Aslih, the righteous forebears. And this is why this group was known as the Salafist or Salafis. So Muhammad Abduh's biographer was Rashid Ridda. Ridda, in many ways, is the godfather of the actual Islamist movement. His main disciple was Hassan al-Banna. And Banna, as many of you will well know, was the actual founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. So Egypt, throughout the 19th century and 20th century, was the place of this great intellectual, political, and cultural ferment, which was about the Islamist movement, that's Salafism. Muslim Brotherhood, again, is the blossom of this. So, from my perspective, the Salafism, currently the Muslim Brotherhood, this is the mainstream. This is the pillar of Egyptian political, intellectual, and cultural modernity. The notion that this local movement, this local intellectual and political movement will not get power in Egypt seems to me ridiculous. The only way that would happen is if they're repressed by the regime, which may very well happen. Insofar as this administration may be pressing to open up the political environment to make room for the Brotherhood, yes, the Brotherhood will take advantage of this and fill any vacuum immediately. But again, the Brotherhood is an integral part of Egyptian political modernity. They will definitely take as much political power as is given. Let me come back briefly because I do want to save some time for questions, and I still have a few more things to say. So let me just touch on an issue, a very significant issue, which is about the peace treaty. It was difficult to tell from reports, though I think it was underreported. There was certainly an anti-American and an anti-Israeli current at a lot of the protests, though it's true this was not perhaps the main current, outright anti-Israel sentiment or outright anti-American sentiment. It did exist, no doubt about it. We saw posters and signs, however, the American press was eager to underplay the role, how much this figured during the protests. But again, all we have to keep in mind is what we've been hearing since 9/11, the notion that Arabs despise the U.S. not only because of our support for Israel, but because we support repressive Arab regimes. And of course, Hosni Mubarak's Egypt was always one that came to the top, as well as Saudi Arabia and then Jordan. But certainly Egypt was one of the top names. So of course, there was a serious anti-American current because people are furious, or a lot of Egyptians were furious that we support the Mubarak regime. But more importantly is this. Insofar as people were protesting specifically against what we might call Mubarakism, or 30 years of this ruling regime, a political elite and a business elite that came to power, and the corruption and the power, prerogatives, and privileges that came to this group, this was all underwritten by the peace treaty. The central plank of Mubarakism is the peace treaty. It's not just the $1.3 billion of military aid that comes to Egypt every year and that underwrites the retirement nests or feathers the retirement nest of senior officers of the military. It's the fact that this $1.3 billion, the military contract, everything that's come out of this, has created a political and business and military elite. And this is what the people on the streets of major Egyptian cities have been protesting explicitly the last 3 weeks, what they're calling, what we can call Mubarakism. I'll put it like this. If I were an Egyptian patriot, and even if I didn't want war with Israel, if I'd gone to Israel and I loved Israel, I would have to say, you know what? This peace treaty is a real problem, because this peace treaty for the last 30 years has been the glue that has empowered this ruling elite. So we need to look at this treaty, and basically this is what Ayman Noor said. Some of you will have heard of Ayman Noor. He's the head of the Ghad party, the Tomorrow party, and Ayman Noor was put in jail by Mubarak. But Ayman Noor, I don't really know in great detail. Some of you may know more, his positions on Israel, but what he said about the peace treaty, that we need to look at this peace treaty again and see if it's in the interest of Egyptians, he has a point. The peace treaty is going to be an issue. Now, the Egyptian military has said, assured both Jerusalem and Washington that it intends to abide by the terms of the treaty, and, this is an important thing. But it's not the only thing that matters, right? We need to keep in mind the three wars in which, 48, 67, and 73. We'll keep 56 out. 48, 67, no, we can even include 56. All of the wars in which the Egyptian military have fought the Israelis, these wars were not waged by the Egyptian regime with the idea that we have to go to war to win this war. In 1948, the Egyptians went to war. King Farouk went to war partly because of a domestic situation, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been calling for war, and Farouk couldn't let them get the upper hand internally. Regionally, there were the Syrians and there were the Transjordanians. Farouk was most concerned about King Abdullah, and if they actually did manage to defeat the nascent Jewish state, they were going to come away with too many spoils. So we can look at the 48 war as also something of an Arab civil war. 67 and 73 were different. There's a theory that the 67 war was incurred by or incited by the Soviets. The Soviets' false intelligence, flawed intelligence about Israeli troop movements drove the Egyptians to war. This was not a war that the Egyptians, Nasser's behavior was certainly reckless, but this was not a war that the Egyptians threw themselves into headlong under the conviction that they could win. And certainly they found out within the first few hours of war they were not going to win that war. The same thing in 1973. Sadat understood what he had to be able to show the Egyptian people in order to make a peace treaty with Israel and to jump from the Soviet side to the American side. So, again, the idea that the Egyptian army is saying now that they don't want war, or when we say, well, the Egyptian army would just lose again to Israel, this is not as significant as the various regional and domestic dynamics. Again, the domestic dynamic to keep in mind is this. The fact is, the peace treaty was the central plank of Mubarakism. Again, I'm not saying that the United States wanted to make this ruling elite corrupt, but the fact is that this deal empowered. Corruption in Egypt is a key political institution. Wasta is never going to go away. But when people will look at this, they will see a ruling regime that came to power on this particular brand of corruption. All of this corruption associated with a peace treaty. That's the domestic dynamic. Before I finish and open it up to your questions, let me talk very briefly about the international dynamic that will make things difficult or that will make things volatile in the region. If we look at the last time Egypt and Israel fought in 1973, what we had was an intra-Arab dynamic, by which I mean Syria, Iraq, the Saudis, the Jordanians. Because Camp David took Egypt out of the war, that Arab dynamic changed. Again, this is really the key to the peace treaty. We took Egypt out of the war with Israel. What we have instead now is more powerful than the intra-Arab dynamic, even though there is an intra-Arab dynamic, which I'll come to in a second, but much more importantly is the regional dynamic. And the regional dynamic consists mostly of Iran and Turkey. So we need to see, is Egypt going to want to compete in that regional dynamic, or how much will their hand be forced? Will they be compelled to compete? We don't know if the Iranians will try to challenge the Egyptians at this moment of vulnerability. It certainly wouldn't surprise me if they did. Again, I don't think it's not something that we can know, but it wouldn't be surprising if the Iranians tried to challenge the Egyptians or just test it to see where they are. And this might happen through any number of ways. Through Hamas, through Hamas attacking Israel. We just don't know what's going to happen. So that's something to look out for. The intra-Arab dynamic, from my perspective, consists almost exclusively now of Syria, which is, Iran's chief Arab ally, and also Qatar. I mean, I tend to downplay the significance of social media over the last month in terms of Tunisia and Egypt. I don't think it was a Facebook or Twitter revolution. But I think certainly if you look at satellite TV, Al Jazeera played a pretty important role. So when I talk about Qatar, I'm not just talking about the tiny emirate in the Persian Gulf. I'm also talking about Al Jazeera, which is an enormous instrument, enormous asset wielded by Qatar and also by Qatar's allies. So that's the regional and intra-Arab dynamic, again, which can all push up the temperature around the region. So again, just to summarize, for the peace treaty, the two things we need to look at are the domestic dynamics and the regional and intra-Arab dynamics.
The U.S. military is comfortable with the Egyptian military because of the aid and the training that we've done with them over the years. Right. Does that give us leverage in terms of our military assistance to Israel? Or does that make it impossible for us to remove our military assistance, to threaten to take it away?
You mean our military assistance to Israel or to Egypt?
To Egypt.
I think we're limited somewhat there. And again, I don't necessarily look, let me put it like this. What I'm trying to describe is, I'm trying to say the peace treaty, it's not just a sign of our strength. We need to also consider to look at the peace treaty as a liability, because this is how many Egyptians are going to look at it. Again, if I were I'm not Egyptian, but if I were an Egyptian and if I had no problems with Israel, I would again be compelled to look at the peace treaty and say, this is a problem. This undergirds every bit of corruption we've seen in the last 30 years of Egypt. The peace treaty is killing us. So I would say that for Americans, we need to be, for American policymakers, we need to be extremely sensitive to this. So the notion that we're going to push people around the $1.3 billion in military aid and the additional $600 billion, something like that, in economic aid, it gives us some leverage, but we also need to realize it's going to boomerang on us as well. This is something that's going to happen. I'm not sure if that answers it specifically. What I want to do is I want to give people other frameworks for this too, because everyone talks about this, the $2 billion a year as though it's it's our ace in the hole. Well, yeah, a little bit, but it's also a problem.
We were asked to ask you, could you please discuss the domino effect activities currently in progress in Bahrain, Yemen, Jordan, Iran, etc.? Are these related to Egypt, or are these independent phenomena?
I think they're all independent phenomenon. I'll put it like this, and I guess I'll come back to this. If you look at Tunisia and Egypt, the two things that these things have in common, actually I'll use this to come into Lebanon. Well, first of all, let me just mention something about Jordan. If you look at Jordan, the issue with Jordan is, right, you have the East bankers and the West bankers. The East bankers and the West bankers have fought before. What we know about Jordan is, so long as the king has the support of the East bankers, that is the tribes, the Transjordanians, the king will be fine. They've fought with the Palestinians before. what the king needs to do is maintain that support. Now, there are problems in Jordan right now. Some of the tribal sheikhs have been upset with the king's wife, Rania, who is Palestinian. So that's something to look out for. Again, the importance of Jordan is to make sure that the king has the East Bankers on his side, because these are the people in the security services and the military. Yemen, we're talking about 15,000 people in the streets of Sana'a, but, in a sense, that is Yemen. Yemen is not really entirely a country. We're talking about small medieval villages, so what we're talking about happening in Sana'a is specifically about Sana'a. Well, that's how I see it, though it certainly can blow up into a very nasty thing. Let me come back to Tunisia and Egypt. What we saw here, again, the way I understand this, these are military coups against military regimes. Basically, the military took down their own representatives and said, you are no longer representing our interests. I see Lebanon also as a coup in this way. What we had happen 3 weeks ago was Hezbollah brought down Saad Hariri's government. Now, Hezbollah was able to bring down this government because the blocking third veto that it won in 2008 at Doha. The reason it was awarded the blocking third veto, meaning that it could stall all sorts of action in the cabinet, was because Hezbollah ran through Beirut in May 7th, 2008, and it attacked Sunnis. They were killing their neighbors. So Hezbollah won this veto in 2008 by force of arms. And finally, although it took them 2 years to succeed on their coup, this is what they started back in May 2008. What we saw 3 weeks ago was the completion of that coup that brought down Saad Hariri, brought down the democratically elected government of Lebanon, and empowered Hezbollah and its allies. This is an extremely important thing. One of the ways that I think you should see Lebanon is, insofar as the administration wants to, the Obama administration wants to back moderates and liberals in the region, I think that we have to make a very clear stand on Lebanon. We can't confuse Hezbollah. The president's counterterrorism czar, John Brennan, has often talked about the moderates in Hezbollah. This is nonsense. Hezbollah is an extremist organization, and this administration needs to be very clear about whose side it's on and what Hezbollah looks like. Because if we want to encourage moderates and liberals, we have to be clear about Lebanon and send out a signal. And now with places like Egypt and Tunisia in play, the administration wants to encourage a liberal current in Egypt and the same in Tunisia and across the region. The way to do that is to start with Lebanon, where we know there is a liberal current. The liberal trend is thinner in places like Egypt and Tunisia, much thinner. What we need to do is prove that we are willing and able and capable of backing our liberal and moderate friends around the region. And Lebanon is the place to start with this. And Lebanon is going to be in the news again very soon, anywhere from the next week to the next month, when the Special Tribunal for Lebanon starts opening up the sealed indictments that were handed down in the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. These sealed indictments were handed down 3 weeks ago. And they're scheduled to be open any time now within the next week to the next month. And Hezbollah members are going to be named, and we'll see if Hezbollah goes to the streets or what. But the administration needs to be prepared for this, and we need to stick up for our liberal and moderate friends in the region.